Good evening, all. I'm Phil Archer, Deputy Director at Reynolda House and the curator of the current exhibition of Founder's Vision. Welcome this evening to a conversation between Allison Perkins, who has been Executive Director at Reynolda House for 18 years, and Barbara Babcock Millhouse, who is its founding president and the generous lender of all of the works in the exhibition next door. Allison and I hope the exhibition to serve as a way to celebrate Barbara's contributions to Reynolda House, to North Carolina, and to the wider field of American art. And sending packing crews and 18-wheeler trucks to cart off all of her treasures may seem a peculiar way to demonstrate gratitude and to pay tribute. But Allison and I have been amazed over the years to see her collection, to see its astonishing variety and the high standards that are maintained. And we knew that to share that variety with you would be a way to look back on the excellence that we've grown to know and love through the scores and scores of works that she's given to Reynolda House in the 40 years, or the almost 60 years since it was founded. Barbara Babcock Millhouse is, of course, the granddaughter of Katharine and R.J. Reynolds and the daughter of Mary and Charlie Babcock. She was the driving force behind the establishment of the collection at Reynolda, and she served as president of the board for 40 years, from the mid-1960s until 2004, seeing to completion this wing named for her parents. She's a graduate of Smith College in art history and has a degree in interior design from the Parsons School of Design, which was of use in the restoration of the historic house, which was completed to coincide with the opening of this wing. She served on the board of directors of the Mary Reynolds Babcock Foundation, the American Painting and Sculpture Committee of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, and the National Committee of the Whitney Museum of American Art. In 1998, she was awarded a doctorate in humane letters from Wake Forest University, where she has served as a trustee. And in 2018, she was awarded the North Carolina Award, which is the state's highest civilian honor. And the award paid tribute, and I'd like to quote, to Barbara's many contributions to the fine arts and culture of North Carolina, her commitment to the preservation of North Carolina history, her foresight in forming what quickly became a nationally renowned collection of American art, and her work as a published author and scholar. So after the conversation, Barbara will be seated in the lobby on this level and is happy to inscribe books that you can purchase in the shop if you don't have copies of them. If you don't have a chance to speak to Barbara personally, there's a comment wall in the lobby where we've been inviting visitors to share their expressions of gratitude to her. And so you can leave one yourself and look at what other visitors in the past 3 weeks since we opened the exhibition have wanted to say to Barbara. So I want to thank each and every one of you for being here tonight, and to ask you to join me in giving a round of our applause and our thanks to Allison and to Barbara. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Before we get our conversation underway, I'd like to thank two really important groups of people. Well, three. First, I'll thank you for being here. I've already done that. But I want to thank Phil Archer and the rest of the entire Reynolda House staff. Phil for his brilliance in curating this exhibition, for doing exceptional research, and for every single staff member who works at the museum, because each of them have a unique role and a unique talent and gift that they bring to the work and the way that this institution functions for our community. Second, I'd like to thank the numerous donors. I think you saw a slide here when you first came in. There was just such a generous outpouring of support for this exhibition, and I want to thank them for making this possible. And so, now, on to our conversation. Barbara, let's start with your earliest studies. You're a graduate of Smith College at a time during which art was taught in a more formalist tradition, line, shape, color, a more analytical point of view. And I think this approach left you wanting more. In some ways, you've talked about that you found it somewhat reductive. So we'll start with a slide of think the very first work of art you purchased?
Let's go back to the 1950s. And soon after graduation, I think your question really is about how did I get started collecting, right? Okay, I want to be sure
Yes.
of that. Well, one reason I got started collecting is because I discovered that all the old masters that you see in the galleries were fake, or they were school painting. And that eliminated a whole lot of art if you were interested in collecting. I do want to, I'm not going to read anything except right now because I think this statement goes with what I just said and it'll get you a laugh from you because this is from a newsletter from, let's see, 1855, believe it or not. And this is about collecting old masters. And it's advice. And the advice is, if you have ever been deluded into making great bargains in Titian's, Van Dyck's, Claude's, or any other old master works, burn them up at once. if you can afford it. If you cannot afford it, send them to auction to be sold for what they really are. After reading this, and learning a lot about the art that was on the market at the time that I started thinking about collecting, I definitely, I hate to say I even had anything by Roysdale, but if I had any old masters, they were gone. They were gone. So that got us involved in looking at the contemporary art scene. And do we have it? Yes, this is it. Okay. This is the first painting that I admit that I bought, okay? When I got out of college, every single artist around, well, I was in New York, of course, every single artist turned into an abstract expressionist. I mean, this was when Pollock and Klein and Gottlieb and Rothko were gods. And we spent a lot of time talking about it because in those days, my father and my stepmother is who I'm talking about, mentioning now, we thought they were pulling the wool over our eyes. What's going on here? You know, all this dripping and strange gesturing and paint all over the place. And what does it mean? Is it for real? We were really asking that question, is this for real? So I decided that I would buy one. I couldn't afford, you know, I mean, by that time, well, Pollock, I think, was dead by then, but the others, de Kooning and people like that, and the prices were already rising quickly. So I had a friend who introduced me to an artist whose name was Bill Scharf. And he had a studio right across from the Museum of Modern Art. And that's what you're looking at here. And I thought he was a fantastic artist. I still think he's a fantastic artist and a great colorist. But the fun thing about my first purchase really is the fact that after I told him I'd like to buy this painting, it's quite a large painting, and I had a car in New York, believe it or not, in those days. And we took his painting from his studio. We tried to get it into the car, but it was too big. So we had to hold it outside the car, facing outward. And then we were driving up Park Avenue. When we stopped for a light, we put the painting down. So we got up to our apartment on 79th Street, and then he had to take it up 3 flights of stairs and hung it on the walls. And we sat down to drink our Tom Collinses, what we were drinking in those days, and waited for the roommates to come. I had 2 roommates, but waited for the roommates to come home. Well, the most outspoken of my roommates did arrive at the door, and she took a look at this painting, and you knew she was about to scream. But she saw a man sitting there who she didn't know who had a beard, and in those days only artists had beards. So you could see, she's putting two and two together very quickly and was very polite. The other roommate came home and just said, I'm not going to live with that. I'm going back to Connecticut. I think what I learned from all of this, this story actually goes on, but I began learning, how powerful art is. And all this was a complete surprise to me. All I wanted to do, I learned at that point that you could not make decisions about art quickly in a gallery. You had to live with it to see whether it was going to continue to exert its aesthetic energy or whatever you want to call it. So I was very serious about this. And I would even get up in the middle of the night and go out and turn the lights on and look at it and see, is it still exciting to me? Well, it seems that a lot of people got word that we had this painting. One of them, I don't know if the name means anything to you, but we used to go to a bar, and the bartender was a man whose name was Malachi McCord. And we ran into friends there and everything. I see you nodding. Well, he apparently started giving these talks about this pornographic painting that these young girls had up on 79th Street. And word got back to us. And I mean, we were just out of college, so we were very innocent. And that's the last thing I ever expected to happen. And mortified. I was mortified. Well, that's not the end of it. We were dating some lawyers. And the lawyers took one look at it and thought it was subversive. And that was even worse. So that is my early experience with collecting. And it took a while, it definitely took a while to get over it. But I never took it down at that point anyway. And the roommate who left came back. She's still a very good friend of mine. And we began to get used to it. But it really was a lesson in how powerful art can be. So I think, are we also looking at Kerner's Farm? No,
Yeah.
this is next.
I think this was the next.
In the same period, it's 1959, I bought this painting by Andrew Wyeth. In the midst of all the splashes and drips and everything else, Wyeth went ahead without, with his realism. And even though the critics hated him, when the Whitney Museum gave a Wyeth show, people were stood up around the corner. I mean, around the whole block. There was a long line waiting to see his work. Well, this painting has been around a long time before. I mean, I obviously like it. It's sort of, as we were talking about, how it looks like the ice is breaking up a little bit and spring is about to come, winter is going away. But it kept delivering to me somehow. I think actually it might have been hanging at Reynolda. I'd walk by and I'd look at it again and again. And I said, I think something's happening here more than just what I'm seeing. And so I decided to compare the house there, which he painted over and over again. It was by a German farmer who actually had been in World War I. And Wyeth was fascinated with him, and he lived in that concrete house. And I guess at that point, I realized that it's where an artist changes reality, that you look and kind of question, say, why did he do it? What is he trying to do? And it became very clear to me that the actual house had a door on this side. It had all sorts of windows. It really looked like a house someone might live in. And then it struck me that it looks like a bunker, a war, a place where the Germans were putting their guns out of all the windows, and it related to World War II. And that's what was behind all that. And then you realize that other paintings by Wyeth, who was sort of my age and sort of a little bit older, but we were really seeped in World War II, and that's what was coming out of this painting and making it the sort of content much more powerful than it was as just a simple watercolor. I guess I sort of overdid that, but anyway.
No, you set us up for next season. In February, we will host an exhibition that launches its national tour right here from Reynolda House in Winston-Salem at Wake Forest University. And this exhibition is called Kerner Farm, Andrew Wyeth's Kerner Farm, The Eye of the Earth, which is what Wyeth called that little farm pond. So the exhibition will travel from Winston-Salem up to Chadsford, Pennsylvania. We are co-organizing the exhibition with the Brandywine Art Museum up in Chadsford. And after Chadsford, it will travel to Jacksonville, Florida. So you'll see it here first, next February. Barbara, much of your research and work in assembling your own collection and the collection here at Reynolda has been scholarly. And there are at least 4 of your books for sale in the museum shop. But in Founder's Vision, we see 2 works of art that you made. One is a gouache that was done as part of your studies at Parsons School of Design. And then another is this copy of a painting by Stuart Davis. So talk to us, why did you decide to copy this painting, and what did you learn in the process?
Well, the idea really was to crack the code, so to speak. How is it possible that an artist could squiggle and do all these things? It's so complicated. How can he do that and still make it exciting and interesting to us? I mean, it's just remarkable. So anyway, I decided that if I copied it, I was going to find the secret to these paintings. My husband had just bought a hacienda in Ecuador, and I thought, oh my God, what am I going to do down there? So I figured that was a good place to start the copying, and I went to the Metropolitan Museum. This report from Rockport is a painting at the one on the left. Mm-hmm. It's not a very, can you tell which one I did? I tell you, mine looks exactly like the original, but it doesn't here. Anyway, I went to the Metropolitan Museum with what we used to have as a Munsell system with little things with all different colors. And I took it up to the painting. I didn't touch the painting, but I took it up to get the right color for the sky and the right color for all the yellow and so forth. And I blocked out when I got down there, I blocked out the canvas too, so I could get it drawn in the right way. And then I got worried that it looked too much like the real painting, and I wrote in cuisine in the center and keto on the right, so I wouldn't get in trouble for copying. And when I got finished, I didn't know, I was in total awe of Stuart Davis. I mean, I have no idea how he did it, how he did this. And he left all these papers of what he was writing and about art and all this stuff, and I tried to read them one time, couldn't understand a word. So that didn't work out either. Anyway, the only thing that happened is the fact that I have a gorgeous painting that I can hang on my walls, and I can still wonder at how he did it. It's amazing. Is there another story that goes with this?
Well, you did not one copy, but a second copy of this painting.
This is hanging in my house here.
And that ultimately led to your purchase of a Stuart Davis.
Yes, that's the next one, right?
Yeah.
Well, this is another story. I was at a cocktail party in New York, and some people were sort of standing around, and I don't know what they said that made me say, my favorite painting by Stuart Davis is for internal use only. And there was a dealer standing there, and he said, Barbara, that's for sale. So it was very expensive. And what I did is I had a number of paintings that I could trade. So I traded, and the dealer was helpful. He put how much he would trade it for. So we got the price way down. And I think it was we were ready to buy it, and it was a beautiful day. I remember a sunny day, walking down Park Avenue to the people who owned, this was privately owned by a couple. to their apartment. And I walked in, and there was the couple, elderly, and they had their lawyer, and there was the dealer, and he had his lawyer. I didn't have a lawyer. I'm the person who's paying for this, for God's sake. Anyway, the dealer and his lawyer became, my lawyer, and there was a lot of stuff that went on. I mean, they wanted to know where this was going to be hung, and I assured them I'll never hang it in my house. It will go to Reynolda House. And they had some relatives that live here that went over to see if Reynolda House would be a safe place for it. And there were other things I know about promising to never to sell it, but I won't do that because you don't know if the market is going to go down or what. You don't know what's going to happen. Anyway, after about 2 hours, the deal went through. And I know walking out, the lawyer said, I thought they would never sell it. And I thought, we went through all that, and you thought that they would never sell it. Okay, that's just the beginning of the story. So it went straight to Reynolda. And I guess about a year later, the archivist came up to me and he said, Barbara, I want you to come and see some letters that belong to your mother. And I went into the archive and he had this box, and there was some papers that she had torn out of Life magazine. And one of those was a full-page color illustration of for internal use only. And don't think I didn't get the shivers. You don't know, this mother died when I was 19 years old. But I thought to myself, oh my God, who's doing all this? Maybe there's someone up there. It was really spooky, and I have no answer for that, but I don't think I possibly could have seen it when she tore it out of Life magazine. It was so unlikely that I was sitting next to her. We lived on it was during the war years, and we lived in a little cottage. I might have been sitting next to her and seen it. I don't know. I'll never know. Anyway, it's a fun painting.
Those are great stories, Barbara. So before the museum opened in 1967, there was a nonprofit enterprise called the Piedmont University Center here at Reynolda, formed in the early 60s. And it was a place for lifelong learning. A consortium of all the higher ed institutions got together in the Piedmont region, and programs were held. And I believe works of art were sometimes brought in, but lectures certainly happened. And Barbara, I know that you were continuing your education through collecting. You were copying works of art, as students have done for centuries. But when you began to collect works of art for Reynolda House, rather than for yourself, you called in reinforcements. And there was a lecture through this Piedmont University Center that inspired you and led to some of your advisors.
Well, I really should start. We already talked about American art. And I still had a feeling that, I was taught that American art was second rate to European art. Copley wasn't Gainsborough or Reynolds and people like that. So again, there's so many prejudices in the art world that you have to get over. And that was certainly one of them. And it happened really because the Piedmont University Center had invited Stuart Feld, who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum at that time, to give a talk about John Singleton Copley, who was also showing at the National Gallery in Washington at that period. And I guess over the years, when we did see paintings by Copley, they were all, yellow varnish and dusty and all of that. They weren't very interesting, but all of these have been cleaned up. And I began to see that Copley, I began to see his genius, that he was not a Gainsborough. He wasn't. His sitters were not royalty. They weren't yet Americans, but they were American. And that shows through in all the portraits that he did while he was in this country. Actually, Copley, during the Revolution, he left and went to England, and his English paintings aren't as good as the American ones. They look too English. These really look American. Well, anyway, so much for that. But when we decided, when the board said it was okay to go ahead, and a lot of people were going through Reynolda House, for instance, right from the very beginning. I think there were crowds of people that just wanted to see the way rich people lived, which was pretty embarrassing. But particularly because my father wouldn't spend any money on the house. Because he knew it was going to become a nonprofit at some point or other. But I don't know where I am. Where am I on this?
You were going to talk about purchasing the Copley that we...
Thinking about going American. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So that's when it was Stuart Feld. He was Stuart Feld, who was a curator at the Metropolitan Museum at the time. He since then has been a dealer, but he was a curator. And after he talked, we went back, he was staying in the guest house, and we went and talked back there, and I'm sure it's Stuart who said, if you're thinking about a collection, it's got to be American. I've asked him since then, he doesn't remember what he said. I don't really remember what he said, but I know that is what changed everything in my mind. And we began to, our board, approved us going and raising $300,000 for an art collection for Reynolda House. And everyone was very supportive. The Babcock Foundation gave some, the Z. Smith Reynolds Foundation gave some, the foundation that the Bagleys had gave some, Ann Forsyth gave some money personally. I didn't put any money into this first group, but I did get I went to the Metropolitan Museum, and Tom Hoving was head of it then, and I asked him if Stuart Feld, that his curator, could help us put a collection together, and he said, fine, you know, like that. Remember? He was pretty flamboyant. So we put together a small committee with Stuart, and that really answers the question here, is getting an expert to help us. And we started off at Kennedy Galleries. Very few people were showing galleries, very few galleries of American art. And we got about 9 major paintings for that amount of money in the first year. It was remarkable. And somebody told me that no one else was collecting American art at that time. This is 66, 67, except for one of the Rockefellers. Which one? John D. Rockefeller, who was giving it all to the museum in San Francisco. So, and this, I should tell you, you know, the Andes of Ecuador, that beautiful grand painting that is always in the Reynolda living room, that had been shown to 3 people before it was shown to us. And one of those was the Yale University Art Gallery. Ted Stebbins was head of that. I'm looking at Bruce because he went to Yale. And Ted Stebbins even told me, he said, we were shown that painting and I turned it down. So kind of in a way he wished he hadn't. So that was interesting. Actually, a dealer some dealer I didn't know had written me a 2-page letter. That must be somewhere around, telling me all the story about that painting and who he had shown it to. So that's how I knew about it, or otherwise I might never have known. But thanks to Stuart, I think we got some really good at it. For those of us who no one knew much about American art, including me, at that time, having a pro in there to help us make decisions was probably the best thing I ever did. But it's public money. I wasn't going to be the one, believe me, to get involved in that. And he did a wonderful job for us. And it's very helpful to have someone like that when we had no problems with the committee at all. They approved everything. And I've talked to Stuart since then, and I said there's one painting that I really would not have bought if it hadn't been for you, and it's the William Merritt Chase. That at the time, Chase was not well thought of. He'd been a teacher, not really much of an artist. People had never seen his wonderful impressionist art that he did, and things like that. We didn't have that information at that time. So I guess that explains too much, probably.
We're fortunate that Stuart Feld was tapped to guide you, Barbara. You've talked about the pitfalls to avoid as a collector, including the danger of buying a work based on what it reminds you of or nostalgia. Can you talk about this risk by sharing some of your own experiences and perhaps discuss your own personal attraction to this painting by Reginald Marsh?
Well, when I was in the decorating, after Parsons, I went for a few years in the decorating business. And I took a client to Brunswick and Feast, which I think many of you know has the most beautiful chintzes you can imagine. And my client chose the most ugly chintz I've ever seen in my life. I didn't even know that Brunswick had anything ugly there. And that was, of course, a big disappointment. But I kept thinking about it and thinking about, now, why would she choose that? And then I thought, well, I'll make a bet. It reminds her of the curtains in her playroom in the basement of her house in Connecticut when she was a child. And then it came to mind that the whole feeling of nostalgia is really connected with aesthetics, and it's dangerous because you could like something, a painting, very much that wasn't very good, that brought you memories of something in your childhood. So Allison says, did you buy that because of nostalgia? This one. Well, it is a very good painting by Reginald Marsh, right? So even if it is nostalgic, but this is a good story. When we first got to New York, we went out to Coney Island a lot. And Coney Island had a ride called the steeplechase. And when you got off the steeplechase, there was a big space around with a kind of fenced in or roped in, with all these men standing outside that looking at you when you got off the steeplechase. Well, what happened to us, or happened to me, is exactly what happens here. He steps on this thing and it blows up your skirt. And in those days, we really wore skirts most and not pants. Now, if you held your skirt down, which is what's happening in this painting, he has an electric shock. And you go like this. And all these men out there laugh. And you've even forgotten to put on some fancy underwear. But anyway, you didn't know that was going to happen. So, I'm always against people buying paintings that are really personal like that. But I can assure you that it's also a good painting. What I didn't realize is when Ellen said to me, do we have the, oh, there she is. When you said to me, did you buy that because it's nostalgic? And I had no idea because Georgia O'Keeffe now anyway has been painting for something like 7 decades. She was always known, I think the more sophisticated people in the art world, took her for granted, didn't like it, and women's art was certainly way down here. But we did know her, and she didn't have a dealer in New York. I remember when I got sort of interested in her, I was told to go see a woman in an apartment that had some drawings of hers. I remember going in and seeing those drawings that zigzag like this and finding them really quite interesting. But this was not in a major show. It was at Nerdler's, and there were a lot of other paintings by a lot of other artists around. So people were not really sophisticated people. I don't think were very interested in her. But that's exactly what I try to do, is to buy paintings before they get hot. As a matter of fact, I'll confess to you, I don't think I've ever bought a painting when it was hot. Okay? Get that straight? Maybe warm, and sometimes cold. But the fun of collecting is to see them, if they do go up in price. I mean, that's great fun. I got a big kick out of that.
You bought two O'Keeffes, one for the museum, but one for yourself. And
the nostalgia for the George O'Keeffe would be that we actually did go to, it's a Lake George painting, we actually did go to Lake George before the war when I was about 7 years old. And I remember it very well because I remember how black the water was. And we were supposed to go in swimming and the water was black. And here you have that kind of, it really had the feeling of Lake George to me. So there was something, I didn't recognize that until Allison asked me. The cedar tree, this is sort of odd, but she also said, well, why did you buy the cedar tree? And I really couldn't think why I bought it for a long time, and then I remembered. It was because it was pink and blue. And I wanted to know whether a painting that was pink and blue could be a great painting. I know that sounds silly, but you've got to remember, those colors are very feminine colors. Babies wear pink and blue, all the things that males hate. It was a male-dominated art world then. And so you could ask yourself whether a great painting could be in these colors, and it is, as we know, a great painting, right? I mean, it has, it's absolutely thrilling, and we don't have to go by all those male prejudices these days because there's actually a tremendous amount of female art, and you might be interested to know that there is a foundation for buying only paintings by women. I can't tell you the name of it because it seems sort of foreign words, whatever, but it exists. And I think that's responsible for putting up a lot of prices at auction when women's art often goes for very high prices these days.
Well, Barbara, we're so grateful to you. When we designed a collecting plan, and every museum needs a collecting plan. It's how you chart the future. It's how you create your wish list of things that you want. And a few years ago, we decided, we want to look at the spectrum of American art, but we wanted to focus on areas where we knew we could grow the collection and should grow the collection in two ways, to collect more works of art by women and by artists of color to be represented in the institution's collection. And with that, you made a promise gift of this painting and two collages by Romare Bearden, which you can also see in the exhibition next door. So Barbara, you've witnessed the expansion of American art over the decades. You've also seen and participated in the parallel growth in the market for American art. So over the next few paintings that we're going to look at, could you talk about the importance of anticipating those artists that will become hot? Because you bought many of these when they were cool.
Well, we all knew that Alex Katz was a good artist early on. He came to Reynolda. We bought a print by him, and he was here. I don't know if anyone remembers that. Oh, good. So I don't know, there's not one moment where you said that Alex Katz was a great artist, but there is a moment when you can actually buy one, which is what is exciting. This painting hangs usually in my guest room in New York, and I walk by the door and I see a drive-in movie out of my eye. That's what I see. And I don't think any people writing about Alex Katz has actually said anything like that. They call it billboard art. But it's more than that. And when these paintings remind you of so many things, it really makes them very, very rich. And he's wonderful. How does he paint a face without any wrinkles? He doesn't want anything like any kind of identity. He doesn't, if you don't tell stories in your art anymore, you never get anywhere. And they're powerful, powerful works. Unfortunately, he's just recently had a show at the Guggenheim, all around. And he's changed his style. So we caught it the right time, 70s and 80s. And after that, I personally think he's gone quite downhill. But don't tell anybody that, because Blumner is another one that moonshine, is that what it's called? Something about moonshine. I've looked at these Blumners for quite a while here and there. You used to see them. And finally, this particular painting really got to me. And I'm proud to say he wasn't doing terribly well in the art market for many years. Finally, in 2000, when did I buy it? I sort of wrote some of this down. 1980.
Mm-hmm.
So 20 years later, the Whitney gives him a full show. And that's gets me very excited. I mean, basically, if you wait until a show, you can't afford them. So you have to get them early. Oh, goodness. Well, Basquiat was sort of first known as Andy
Warhol, Andy Warhol.
I knew I was going to skip a name. Andy Warhol's boyfriend. And you look at them and they look, well, as you can see in front of them, messy. There's this stuff written on them. I mean, they look crazy. I didn't pay too much attention to them until one day I saw one and it struck me. He's a really good artist, isn't he? People were saying that, but I have to feel it. So I put a bid in for one at Sotheby's, I think. It went for about 4 times. My bid, by the way, is always around the reserve. It went 4 times higher than my bid. And something similar happened with the Jeff Koons. This is a wonderful one. I'm not going to buy the dog. The dog is, that, by the way, is all, it doesn't look like it, but it's all impatience. It's all flowers. I don't know why the color is wrong. And as you can see, it's as high as the building behind it. And when it struck me that Jeff Koons was as good sometime after I saw this, the same thing happened. It looked at a decent price, and then it went zooming up. So the process of collecting today is simply not my style, if I could afford it, not my style. In the old days, when you went into a gallery, in the 60s even, you went into a gallery and you said, I'm really interested in that painting. The dealer says, we'll send it over and you can look at it for a week or two. That is entirely different from making these extremely quick decisions that you have to make on contemporary art. And the good paintings are usually bought before I can even get to the gallery. And that's probably in some way lucky. Okay, now why are we looking at this brown thing? Well, my ideal has always been to recognize a great painting before anyone else does. And as I've realized, I kind of recognize them when they're sort of only a few people that recognize them when they're warm. But I'd go around to galleries on Saturdays. Usually a friend would call and say, can I go with you? And you never go and say, I'm going to buy a painting by such and such, because you never know what you're going to see. So you have to be around and just look and look. And the dealer, Barbara Gladstone, I think it was, brought this out. And I went berserk. I thought this was the most powerful, interesting painting I'd ever seen. I could tell that it was about the rubble, I could tell it was about Germany after the war, the rubble, that kind of thing. I could see that in this painting, but a little sky, and I don't know what the sand is. But it was extremely powerful. And then the reason I know that I did not recognize the name of the artist is because I remember sitting there reading an article in a magazine and saying to my husband, oh, look, there's an article about the artist of that painting I just bought. And then there'd be another article. Oh, look, another article. Anyway, today he is considered the most important German artist. He and Richter are on the top completely. He's had 2 full-length movies made. I guess he kind of had them made of himself. One of them, the most recent one, shows him in these warehouses where he has these huge paintings, and he rides a bicycle from one warehouse to another, and in the movie, he had a flamethrower in his hands, and he'd go up to a canvas, and it would go zzz, and it would get all chalky and black, and then he'd go on to another one. I'm happy to say the North Carolina Museum bought one early. And I really thought that was, somebody's on the ball there. That's great. So this is one that I look at every day. I don't know that my husband hasn't made me take it down yet. But it was exciting to me anyway, exciting. And it is a German, most of the art I buy, of course, is American, but every now and then I fall for a German painting for some reason or other.
Well, Barbara, next door in the gallery, we were a few weeks ago standing in front of this watercolor, and you said to me, I looked at hundreds or galleries full of Venetian watercolors by Sargent until I found this one, and this was the one. So would you talk to us a little bit about what you see, the features and the qualities that made this particular watercolor stand out?
Well, I think the others were sort of messy and unfinished. But if you're painting from a gondola, what do you think it's going to look like, particularly if a boat speeds by? So this was simply more finished, I think, than the others. That you really actually, we seem to know what the palazzo is, and you can see the head of the gondola right there. So he is painting it from the gondola. And Sargent is a great artist. He is a great artist. And you want to show him, I want to show him at the best work that we can get. But, I think this is a marvelous watercolor, don't you?
I do.
No magic to it, but.
Well, and I think you could also talk about your deliberations and your study of Edward Hopper and finding, looking for a work that you could acquire, which was not so easy because there weren't many left when you found this.
Well, I've always known that Hopper was a great artist, but everything he did was ugly. And his wife had to pose, when he did nudes or anything, his wife wouldn't let him have a model. And so if he does a figure, it's always his wife, who isn't very appealing. Apparently Hopper couldn't talk. He couldn't carry on a conversation with you. I guess everything went into his work. And I'm not putting down his paintings, because they are great paintings. They just happen to be, the colors are kind of ugly. But they are great paintings, and I guess I should have overlooked that and bought one of the oils. But instead, I got the watercolor that you see here, which I also think is a great painting. And I wake up every morning and I look at it, and I never tire of it. I think Phil told me this, that what Barbara said, that all he wanted to do was to paint light on the side of a house. Well, if you and I had done this, you would not have it, look at it every day and like it. So there is, again, a kind of magic. I believe the house is still standing, but I think it has some Victorian touches on it. And I don't understand why it is so powerful, and to me, I certainly don't think a telephone pole is very sexy. Or a white facade. Now, if Birchfield had painted this, he would have painted the windows shades sort of half down, and they would look like eyes, which is a little bit too cartoony. I mean, Hopper wouldn't have done anything like that. But it's a very exciting, unexciting painting. That's what I'd say about it. You're going to talk about
I'll tee up this next work of
the
art.
next one.
So in 2011, Alice Walton opened her museum, Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Bentonville, Arkansas. And I was pretty certain that Barbara would get an invitation to attend the opening. And I said, if Nick doesn't want to go, will you take me as your plus one? And she said, I don't know if I'll get an invitation, but if you get an invitation, take me. So there was a Scholars Day before the museum opened to the public, and I said, come on, Barbara, let's go to Bentonville. And that was long before there was a 21C hotel. We stayed in a upscale motel. I think you remember the carpet.
Yes.
But we had the museum pretty much to ourselves and spent about 3 hours there. And Barbara and I would sort of separate and then regroup and compare notes. And she was off on the other side of a gallery as we entered the modern section. And I heard her go, oh! And I ran over and I said, what? And she saw this painting that was part of their collection. So you tell the rest of the story. What made you gasp when you saw this?
Well, about 50 years ago, I don't know if it was that long, but I had this painting in my apartment in New York. It was in the 60s. I'd seen it, I liked it, and I asked the dealer if I could look at it for a while. And he sent it over. I had it for about 3 weeks, and I just decided no. It was dark. I didn't have the correct lighting, and so I sent it back. And, but you know, the first time I saw it was at the Marsden Hartley. It's by Marsden Hartley. I think that says all that there. There was an exhibition at the Phillips Gallery in Washington. And the feature painting was this very painting that I had turned down. And I seems sort of embarrassing to me that I had overlooked something, but it was good lighting. That helped because I don't have good lighting at home. And it had the most wonderful frame on it, that sort of rough hue. The frame looked just like these dark marks in the other Hartley that you see here. And I hope you can find out how to get a frame like that, because I would like to put it on.
Yeah.
I think it made a huge difference.
Well, you found a great Hartley for Reynolda in Vinyl Haven, Maine, the one you eventually acquired.
Maine, well, Hartley did a lot of different styles. He did still lifes. He did those German officer paintings. These paintings are tough. They're very masculine. But I think what's most typical of him really are his main paintings, and I hope you agree with me that this is, the more I look at this, the more I like it. I think it's really very strong. And I kind of like the name End of the Storm. You know, it looks like the end of a storm, doesn't it, in Maine?
Yeah. Barbara, most of the works of art that you live with are on view in the gallery next door. And I'd like to ask you about the experience of seeing your own collection assembled here at Reynolda, especially when these works of art have been surrounding you in your living room or your bedroom, waking up to them in the morning. I want to remind us that looking at art is an intellectual exercise, it's emotional, it's personal, but context is also really important. So for you, Barbara, the context of seeing your works of art in the gallery setting here in the museum, I'm curious to know what struck you when you saw these works of art assembled? What stood out?
Well, one, I was struck by the fact that each one is very different from the others. And so often you go into exhibit, you see all impressionists or all by one artist, and each one was distinct. That is what hit me. But you know what I liked the best was the sculpture, because to see sculpture correctly, it has to be lit. And I don't think that in my house or whatever that the sculpture really is presented as well as it should be. And so the sculpture really came through to me as being quite wonderful. And what I tried to do was something different with sculpture. Is I thought, thinking that Reynolda House would have it someday, I wanted to have each piece very different in material and in style from each other. And so that was sort of on purpose. So you have one that's bronze. You have one that's brass. This one is brass. You have the nodelman, which is wood. And then the Mary Frank. I've got a story that goes with Mary Frank. Lucy, well, of course, that's terracotta. And Lucy Lippard was a critic who, I think she was probably a feminist, because she called for a woman's art. This was, again, when the art world was dominated by men. She called for women's art that was both fragile and strong. And when I walked into this show for Mary Frank, because a lot of these were, there were about 10 of them in the show, I saw it immediately. It's very fragile, but it's also very strong. Later, when I was on the collections committee of the Whitney Museum, the collections committee was considering buying a similar sculpture by Mary Frank. The men would not vote for it, but all the women did. And one woman came up to me at the meeting and she said, Barbara, we're going to put up such and such amount of money for the Mary Frank. Would you put up some money for it too? And I immediately said yes. But I thought that was quite interesting that they didn't go for this. Don't you think?
Yeah. Lastly, Barbara, I think everyone knows when you and I have shared the stage together, we've often talked about your latest publication. And you have a new research project, and I know that our audience would love to hear about what you're working on next, in addition to these 4 publications that we have.
Well, I'm just thinking, you know, the reason I can do this is because Reynolda Archives has saved the letters of my father from Paris and from London. Or otherwise, you know, we wouldn't know anything about him at all. But my father enlisted right after Pearl Harbor, and he went and he became, he went into basic training. He was 42 years old, and he could have been a commissioned officer without ever having to go through basic training. But he didn't. And a lot of people wondered why. And of course, when I'm doing this book, I really wanted to know why. But I found a letter that his mother had written. And the letter more or less says, "Dear Charlie, how could you possibly have enlisted in the Army? You are too weak. You get, every September, you get hay fever. When you get hay fever, you are miserable." So you kind of know why he went into basic training. He had to prove to his mother. He says all the time he's proving to his children or whatever. Well, we didn't know what, we were too young to understand. He was proving to his mother, no question about that. So you see him there in the middle picture, or the picture down there, after basic training. He's got a good physique. He really, in some of the early pictures, he was pretty pudgy. And so, he loves showing that off. He was stationed after he was not in combat really, he was in civil affairs. And he was 42 years old. And we were told that going through basic training was an experiment because he was apparently second to the oldest in the basic training. And I'm surprised he didn't die of a heart attack, but thank goodness he didn't. What was I going to tell about the V1s? Well, when he was in London, it was actually very dangerous. But the way the English handled that is amazing because on D-Day, after D-Day, Hitler sent his weapon called a V1 over to London, which it was a flying bomb that didn't have any man in it, so to speak. I'm going to give it away. They called it a rocket, but apparently it really wasn't a rocket. But it came over there were explosions apparently all night long in London from this V1 bomb. But in his letters, the first month of his letters, he never mentions a word about it. And there were explosions all over the place. And that was because it was censored. And it was interesting to me because a long time I realized that none of his letters were blacked out in any way, which anyone who's tried to read letters from that period know that they get blacked out. Well, apparently officers are charged with doing their own censorship. So he may have been a little bit too strong on that because he doesn't mention the V1s until a whole month later. And then he writes letters to Mother about how with a V1, as long as it has a squeal, and as long as they hear the squeal, you're safe. But if the squeal stops, it drops, and you better run for shelter quickly. They had names for it, like Buzz Bomb and Virgin Mary, because it didn't have a man in it. Okay. Anyway, the English were very good at ignoring this horror. I'll tell you one horror that happened early on is that there were about 125 people in church in St. James Park, and one of these bombs landed right on the church and killed 125 people. That was not, as far as I can tell, that wasn't in the newspapers because they didn't want to frighten people. When those statistics came out, I think is when a lot of people began to leave London. Because they had been bombed, early on. They'd been bombed, I think, for about 4 years, on and off. And they're very stoic, I can tell you that. But he went from London. From London, he went to Paris. Paris was safe because all the Nazis they were scrammed, they were gone. And his Paris letters are much more interesting because he goes to nightclubs and the Folies Bergère over and over again. Somebody said it was so cold, apparently that winter it was colder than it's ever been. And someone said that it was so cold that the dancers for Folies Bergère had to get drunk before they could take all their clothes off. But so there are little funny things about Paris. I tried to make it more interesting. I tried to relate everything more, the reason it's taking so, relate everything more to what was happening in the war at the time. And I got really caught up in the submarines that were being bombed out just off the Outer Banks. And now there's a lot of articles. You know, they said that they were censored and they wouldn't tell people that those submarines going down 2 every day in, say, January, February, March 42. But the Winston-Salem newspaper is full of it. That they couldn't have censored it very much because we had no way of in those early time of the war, we had no way of sinking those German subs. And they were, all in all, in that period of time, there was about 4 months there, they sunk as many as 70 tankers and merchant ships. So if you like to go do any diving, they're all down there. But that was, to me, that was fascinating. And it didn't have much to do. I was trying to connect it up with the fact that when the war started, Mother left Connecticut and came to North Carolina. And even though I think it's about 300 miles away, still, you know, it was in those newspapers. And I don't know why people didn't make more of it, but I think it's because the German subs went after tankers. They didn't go after there probably weren't any cruise ships, but they went after tankers and merchant ships. And, you know, they didn't have any celebrities on those ships. Some of them were British. They were, the idea the Germans had is we're going to starve out England, because a lot of those ships were British ships, and they went up the coast and then across to Nova Scotia to England. And I did read that about 1/2 of their food supply, during that period of time, their food supply went down about 1/2, and it was already bad. But those English weren't going to give in. And finally, by July, we had learned how to sink some of those subs. The first one that we sunk was in April. And so in April and May and so forth, we could sink some of the subs, the German subs, and then they withdrew when they went over to the Atlantic. So a lot of people today say that the war would have been over if we hadn't been able to because we weren't getting supplies either. And it's really fascinating. You know, we have the governor, Broughton, wrote a letter to the government saying, you know, we can't do anything about this, you know, we need your help. And then he quotes some people, he said, I guess they were in Morehead City, and he said, those Germans are standing on the bridge of their subs talking, the commanders are talking to each other out there. You know, I mean, they actually saw them, and then he says another sort of interesting, he says, and they just sunk one of our ships, and the submarines are dancing around like dolphins. I wish I had more of those quotes, because they're sort of fun, and I guess I can find them. But anyway, so you have my whole life story. You could go home now.
Well, Barbara, as we close out, you talked about the finding in our archives and the articles that your mother tore out of Life magazine. But your father also worked, he also purchased works of art. You want to close by sharing the story that when he was in a gallery looking at Ernst Kirchner.
Well, in the letters, he mentions Jim Rorimer, who was head of the cloisters and then head of the Metropolitan Museum. And so he says maybe Rorimer will show him some art. And then Mother writes back and said, you always liked art. I hope you see some good things. Well, Rorimer I looked up where Rorimer was at that time. He was already in Germany, so he never got together with my father. But, my father was a stockbroker, and he went to, I forget who was head of the North Carolina Museum at the time, but he was German or who, anyway. I think he probably said, "What's next?" Because the Impressionists had all risen in price. And everybody knew that because it was in the news about any time Impressionist, French Impressionist, that's not an American one, got sold, it would be a record-breaking price. So we went to the head of the museum and said, "What's next?" And he said, "German Expressionism." So the next thing I knew, of course, I didn't know about all this at the time, but he called me up in New York and he said, "Barbara, I want you," and first of all, it was odd that he was in New York because he was living in Winston-Salem. But anyway, he said, "I want you to come down this gallery and see some things." So I went trotting down there, and there were 3 paintings by Kirchner, German Expressionist. You see one there. And he said, "I'm going to take those 2. He bargained it down. "I'm going to take those 2, and I want you to buy that one." And I said, "Oh, Daddy." I said, "I see those go at auction all the time," which was true. Anyway, I bought it. You do what your father tells you to do. And of course, we love it more and more and more. It hangs right in my apartment in New York. And this the later Kirchners were sort of looked down upon because his earlier ones were, I guess you would call more cubistic or wilder. And these are easier to take. And then he actually, the story doesn't end with that because I still have it. But my father dies and my stepmother goes out to live in California, and she brings the 2 paintings that she got out there by Kirchner. And I'm walking down the street one day, Madison Avenue one day in New York, and I look in the window of a gallery, and there's one of her paintings. So I called Winifred up quickly. I said, "Winifred, how much did you sell the Kirchner for?" And she said, "Oh, Victor Hammer's the one who cheated her. I think she said something like $30,000. I said, "Winifred, they're selling for $350,000. But she was old then, and she was a very good businesswoman, but I think at that point, she was old, and, what could she do about it anyway? So I said, "She had 2 of them." So I said, "Well, I'll buy the other one." And she called up Victor, and he, of course, said it was already sold, whether it was or not. But the story doesn't end there, because I'm opening fairly recently, I'm opening an art magazine, and I see a reproduction of one of the paintings. And it's at the Worcester Museum, the Worcester Art Museum. And we were talking about the fact that we really should write to them, because usually they don't know who the former owners are, and tell them, that we know the painting. We want it back. We got cheated, something like that. You remember the paintings, don't you, Bruce? No. So anyway, thank you very much for coming. I very